Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today, video number 2 in my series about making a throwing knife. So in the little blurb up top, I said that we're going to be making a throwing knife in 3 different videos. What I mean by that is that it's the same design. All 3 knives are going to look pretty similar, but we're going to make them in different ways. So today, belt grinder, basic knife making type things, a little bit higher level of tools required than video number 1. If you want something super simple and you haven't caught that one already, check out the card and that'll take you to the first video in the series. Alright, let's jump right into it. As I mentioned in the earlier video, the knife used in all 3 videos was designed in Fusion 360, a CAD/CAM program. The reason for this is that in the 3rd video we'll be executing that knife on a CNC machine, but in this case we're just using the CAD design to supply us with the rough outline of the blade. I'll begin in earnest by drilling holes in the tang on my mill. I'll use my DRO to place the holes exactly 3 inches apart. As was mentioned in the earlier video, these holes are not important in the production of this particular knife. I'm just making 3 duplicate knives in the videos, and the holes will actually be used in the making of the 3rd knife, so they're just here for uniformity of design. If you're making a similar knife, you can skip them, or just drill the hole at the far end of the tang so you can hang them somewhere. The steel we're using here is 1095 high carbon steel, different from what we used in the first video and different from what we're going to use in the 3rd. I'll coat the blade in layout fluid. Now I'll cut out the design from a 1:1 scale drawing produced in Fusion 360. Using a carbide tip scribe, I'll transfer the lines of the knife. In the earlier video, I only drew a very rough outline, then used comparisons to the drawing for reference while shaping. In this one, I'll do a much more precise outline on the steel. Now I'll take the blade to my 2x72 inch belt grinder and start profiling the outline of the blade using 40 grit ceramic belt. I should note that I always do profiling with a belt that's been broken in a little. If you jam a sharp corner into a nice fresh belt, you'll scrape off a lot of the abrasives and wear it out faster than necessary. I'll start on the flat platen with the tool rest or grinding table, call it what you want. By setting the tool rest at a very precise 90 degrees to the belt, I can grind the margins of the blade dead square. Now most of this is pretty cut and dried. I'm just working my way as quickly as possible up to my lines. But the interior of the handle curve doesn't play very well with the flat platen, so once I've gotten everything pretty close, I'll switch to a large contact wheel and grind that interior curve. There, all profiled. Now it's time to grind the bevels. First, I'll mark the center of the edges with this scribe. This reference will show me how far to take my grind lines so that I can maintain symmetry from side to side of the knife and evenness from end to end of the bevel. You can use layout fluid to mark this if you want to, but the scribe leaves a bright little line on the steel that's easy enough to see if your lights are situated correctly. A quick note about design philosophy. Many throwing knives are basically dart-like, meaning they have just dinky little bevels at the end and nothing resembling a cutting edge, whereas some, like this one, have longer bevels like true knives. I chose the longer double-edged type design here entirely because it makes for an interesting grinding challenge, no other reason. In order to successfully grind double-edged blades, you have to make sure that the grinds on all 4 facets or bevels are extremely even. This is no picnic when freehand grinding, but if you're just learning to freehand grind, it's a great way to challenge yourself and develop your grinding skills. The key measure of how well you've ground this kind of dagger shape is how well you maintain the center line formed at the juncture between the 2 bevels. Straight is good, wavy is bad. It might seem like scribing a center line down the middle of the knife would help. It won't. You'll see why in a minute. I'll begin by grinding the first bevel, taking it evenly all the way down to the tip, maintaining precisely the same angle from beginning to end. Don't make the mistake of thinking that you want to establish the center line now. As I'm grinding, I'll switch to the opposite bevel on side 2. Once I've ground that, I'll swap sides on the grinder and grind the other 2 bevels. I don't have a good angle for filming this, but the grinding process is exactly the same. You're just using the opposite hands. The center line will form organically and correctly as long as all your bevels are even. See, if we'd scribed a center line, we'd just grind the thing out as soon as our first bevel reached full width, so it wouldn't help us out at all. Now, since the sole function of this knife is to stick into something, a cutting edge is unimportant. If you want to make your grind lines very narrow, it'll be way easier and the knife will still work fine. But the sharper it is, let's face it, the better it'll stick into whatever you're throwing it at. Now everybody has one side that they grind better on. So when grinding on your weak side, just slow down a little and focus on keeping that bevel even and consistent. If you do, a nice clean center line will develop. If the center line appears to not actually be centered, it probably means that your angles are slightly different from side to side. No problem, just adjust those angles and creep up to the line. I always reserve a little space to clean up my grind lines at the end and fix any mistakes I might have made. Once I'm pretty close to my goal with the 40 grit, I'll switch grits, moving to 60, then to 120. I've left the edge relatively thick by knife making standards, about 30 thousandths of an inch thick. Ultimately, I'll only really sharpen the last inch or so of the blade to keep from cutting myself while throwing. You can go thicker or thinner, there's really no magic formula here. Thinner's sharper, thicker's more robust. And here we go. The blade is now ready for heat treating. So let's talk a little about heat treating. The key thing with a throwing knife is that you don't want it to be too brittle. Now some people don't harden throwing knives at all. That's fine, but real knife makers won't be satisfied with that. I know I'm going to get a bunch of trolls bitching at me for saying this, but I'm just saying. Just because a second-rate way of doing something kind of sort of works doesn't mean it's a good way of doing it. What I'll be doing here is differentially hardening the blade. This strategy, the same basic idea used in making Japanese swords, results in a blade that will be very resistant to breaking, but at the same time, it won't go dull the second it hits a pine knot. Now my point here is not that this is the best or the only way of doing this. In the previous video, we dealt with the shock resistant problem in a completely different way, spring tempering a very different kind of steel so that the entire blade was brought to an equally hard, but relatively shock resistant temper. So we're heating the blade in the forge. Now the way I'm doing this only works for very specific steels, 1095 being one of them. When oil quenching 1095, which is on the border between being an oil hardenable steel and a water hardenable steel, the edge will cool quickly enough that it will harden. But the body of the blade, which is much thicker and retains more heat, will not harden because it doesn't cool down fast enough. This will give you a thin margin of hardened steel on the impact edge, while the rest of the knife stays soft and impact resistant. I won't get into the nuances of the metallurgy here, just trust me when I say that this only works for a very short list of steels. When the blade reaches about 1500 degrees, I'll plunge it into warm peanut oil. This will cause the edge to harden. I'm only putting the blade in at first, not the handle. Some of the handle might harden if I quench the whole thing, so I'll avoid that by letting it air cool a bit before fully immersing the blade in oil. Once it's cooled to room temperature, I'll test it with a file to see if the edge has hardened. After a quick wipe down with rubbing alcohol to remove the oil residue, I'll place the blade in my heat treating oven, 2 cycles for 1 hour each. Can you do this in your kitchen oven? Absolutely. And here's the result. It's now fully functional. All I need to do is clean it up with the belt grinder. I'll throw on a 220 grit belt and take off the ugly. If there are any problems remaining with the grind lines, now's the time to fix them. Now I'll take it outside into the rainforest in my backyard and throw it into tree trunks until the rainforest is destroyed. Thanks for watching, guys. If you feel like you got something out of this video, don't forget to subscribe. Also, click on the link to Patreon for a great way to give back to the channel. Plus, check me out on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Links in the description. If you want something sharp and pointy, maybe a gift for yourself or one of the cooler people in your life, check out my Tactics Armory website and pick up one of our tactical or outdoor knives. And finally, if you want to learn to make hamones or Japanese swords, check out WalterSorrellsBlades.com, where you can find videos about how I make hamones, as well as forging, mounting, polishing, and fittings for Japanese swords. Thanks, and see you soon.